Again, Gary Segars, Winning Cures Everything. He joins us now on 365 Sports and Sikkim 365 Radio. Gary, thanks for your time. So, you know, you kind of get this conflict, not you, but nothing is imminent, and then there are things that we sooner rather than later, as Trev Alberts said. What do you feel?
Well, let me go ahead and correct you right off the bat. That was not my interview, although I would love to take credit for it. That was Nick Handley from ESPN Omaha.
Okay.
So now Nick is fantastic, and Trev would not come on with a national show right now. He would be handling all the stuff in state. That certainly makes sense. But as far as my opinion on this, I think everything is at a standstill until we get Notre Dame's answer. And I don't think we get Notre Dame's answer until not only the Big Ten rights come in, which of course should be sometime before Labor Day, and it may not even be then. I think once we figure out what's going on with the college football playoff, that'll be the next round to figure out whether or not Notre Dame can stay independent and still make the same amount of money, or at least something similar to what the Big Ten would offer if they were to bring Notre Dame in.
What are Nebraska fans' feelings on the conference getting bigger? Is this good for them that USC is in there? And you know, we've kind of speculated on it. Back in the Tom Osborne days, they used to be able to go into California and pluck some guys out of there. Now that they might be playing there, would that help?
I believe it might help some, but you forget college football is so nationalized now that you don't necessarily have to travel anywhere to be able to recruit those spots. I was looking through today. There's a post over on Reddit about the P5 schools that are going to visit G5 schools, and some of them just make absolutely no sense. Like, why is North Carolina going to play at Georgia State? Is it because they want to try and get more in the Atlanta market? It doesn't make any kind of reasonable sense. I don't know necessarily that bringing in USC and UCLA helps Nebraska, right? I think the Nebraska fans are excited about the prospects of bigger games and maybe of, you know, not having to play that West slate in the Big Ten because it's such a different brand of football from what Scott Frost wants to play. But at the same time, I don't know how excited they'll be because it's just more big-time brands, more good schools that they're going to have to play on a week-in and week-out basis.
So, you know, what are your thoughts right now, Gary, overall in college football? We have this USC, UCLA. A year ago, Texas, Oklahoma. There's always what can the Pac-12 do? What's Notre Dame going to do? What is your sense? I know the Notre Dame and the Big Ten contract being announced, all that. What is your sense that where we'll be at the end of the year?
At the end of the year, I don't know that a lot is going to change at the end of this year. Right. I think we're pretty set on what it's going to be right now. What Alberts was saying as far as sooner rather than later, I think is more looking, you know, the next 2 to 3 years. Right. Because that's still a pretty short timetable as far as realignment goes, especially considering, you know, up until last year, that was the first time in, 9 years that we had any kind of movement, really, except for at the lower levels, of course. And there's always movement at the lower levels. So where I think this thing is going, I can't figure out a couple of things. If you had asked me this last week, I would have been absolutely convinced that Stanford was going to be the team that joined Notre Dame, and they would both go to the Big Ten, you know, probably later on this year, maybe early next year, sometime around there once we figure out the playoff situation. But I don't know that I'm necessarily sold on that. You know, Stanford has a $37.8 billion endowment. Now, if they wanted to be big-time players in college athletics, they would do that. But if you look back in the 2020 COVID season, you know, they were talking about having to cut some of the non-revenue sports at the school. Well, if you got a $37 billion endowment, why would you ever have to cut sports? Like, I think it would be more likely that Stanford would end up cutting the football program than they would be to move to the Big Ten. If it's only about football. Now, if it's about academics, et cetera, which some of this stuff has to do with, then maybe Stanford does make that move because I think they are the most likely partner with Notre Dame. But as far as, you know, value for the Big Ten, who actually provides that value? That's what I can't figure out is if they want to control that late night window, is that really that important of a window for them? Because if so, USC is not going to be playing all of their home games at 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. Like, I just don't see that as happening. So you have to bring somebody else in. Are Oregon and Washington worth that? Are Cal and Stanford worth that? But, you know, those two in the Bay Area, you know, do politics get in the way? That's another big question in all this. And I hate talking about politics, but is it something that the Big Ten wants to have to deal with if something like the COVID pandemic were to happen again? I'm so interested in, maybe we're looking at the wrong area, because you notice he did bring up the grant of rights being up for the Pac-12. Well, maybe that grant of rights won't be up. Like, maybe those schools will sign a grant of rights, even if it's just for 5 years or so for the next TV deal. Maybe we need to be looking at the ACC. Like, was he hinting at something where maybe Miami or North Carolina or Virginia, another academic institution that has a pretty big football brand, could one of those be a school that heads over to the Big Ten and provides a little bit of value? That's what I'm curious about. Which way are they wanting to go? Because it doesn't sound like that they are sitting still. I think they're going to do something else. I just cannot tell exactly what it's going to be.
Well, Gary, if you look at their previous strategy, it's about markets, right? And time zones and places in the country where they can have everything covered, so that there's cable network carriage and population centers and things like that. So if they already have LA, does San Francisco really do that much better? If you could get Miami, if you could get, you say you're in D.C., but could you really own D.C. if you got Virginia to go with Maryland, Charlotte, North Carolina, those kind of things? Those are kind of interesting to me because, where are they not? They're not in Texas. They're not, in places like that are football hotbeds. Like, where could you go if you're the Big Ten and you really wanted to expand that footprint totally nationally?
Miami does certainly make sense. And I'll tell you this, I heard you guys talking about SMU and the new NIL collective and everything. SMU certainly makes a little bit of sense, not necessarily for the Big Ten, but, I kind of got laughed at on my show by some people when I mentioned that the ACC and SMU had some talks, right? And it wasn't anything major. It wasn't like an impending deal. But SMU would kind of make sense to the ACC, especially if they're wanting to get into the Texas market, right? As far as the Big Ten goes, the reason I bring up the Bay Area is because the Bay Area has the largest contingent of alumni for the Big Ten of anywhere in the country. So if you're wanting fans to be able to come out to games, whether it be in Palo Alto or at Berkeley, et cetera, that would be somewhere that you could get them to come back out. Maybe reinvigorate an alumni base that hasn't been touched by the sport in a long time. As far as markets go, yeah, it totally makes sense. But once you've got, they basically claim New York with Rutgers. I don't know that they necessarily should claim it, but they've got New York, and then they've got LA, and they've got Chicago. You've got the three largest media markets in the country already. So maybe Miami makes sense, but, how much more do you need if you've already got those three major ones and you've already got a large swath of the Midwest anyway?
Do you feel like they would have any interest at all? You mentioned the cities. Where do you think Phoenix with Arizona State and Arizona come into play at all? If anything at all, does that move the needle for anybody?
I don't think it's the Big Ten. I think it would certainly move the needle for the Big 12.
Right.
There's not a lot of huge markets in the Big 12, but there are large fan bases. So, it's a great question. And I will tell you, at one point about 3 weeks ago, I felt so sure about certain things, about Notre Dame joining the Big Ten, and there's no way they can keep up, et cetera. Hey, here's an interesting question. I'm going to change topic just a little bit. Let's get back over to Notre Dame for a second. So I was convinced on Notre Dame joining the Big Ten, right? Well, we're talking about these Big Ten media rights negotiations, et cetera. Why on earth would the Big Ten decide to bring in NBC if NBC is trying to pair them with Notre Dame? Like, if the Big Ten bringing in NBC and giving them a game every week, if that allows NBC to pay Notre Dame close to what they're asking, right? They're wanting $75 million a season. Why would they do that if they really want Notre Dame to join? You see what I'm asking? Like, does that make any sense at all for the Big Ten to do?
No. Yeah, I get you.
So that's where I'm going at with this is, you read the Nicole Auerbach tweet.
Yeah, I did.
Does that – it doesn't seem like NBC would be the next one up. Now, I could totally see Fox keeping ESPN away from the table as far as Big Ten rights are concerned. But I also don't think that they're going to want to bring in NBC if it means that they're not going to get Notre Dame. So, yeah, all of this expansion stuff is phenomenally interesting. But I every week that goes by, the more stuff that I hear, this stuff from Trev Alberts just seemed to cloudy the waters more than it did clear them up.
Do you think that the Big Ten and the SEC have the same end game, or are they just reacting to each other's shots?
I think both of them did not necessarily intend on expansion. That's what I think. I think USC was interested in the Big Ten, right? USC and UCLA. And I think Texas and Oklahoma were interested in the SEC. Once those schools ask you, then of course you have to say yes, because if you don't say yes, they're going somewhere else. So the SEC could not afford to tell Texas and Oklahoma no, because they would go to the Big Ten. And at that point, then the SEC maybe has to try and bring in, USC and UCLA if they're trying to get out of their Pac-12 deal. But, how much more ridiculous does that sound with USC traveling cross country to play Alabama and LSU? I mean, it sounds ridiculous. So I think that they never intended on doing this, but because their brands are so valuable and because they were going to be making the vast majority of the money, they almost had to make the moves. And I do think that Fox probably played a big part of this, because once Fox got their fingers into the Big Ten, they kind of started running the show. I have never seen anything like what they're doing with their media rights negotiations, where Fox is in the room with these other companies. Like, I cannot believe that they are at the table listening to offers from ESPN and NBC and CBS. I mean, I don't know that that's ever been done.
Yeah, that's a Godfather move right there.
No, that's called the Jay Leno.
Yeah,
Jay Leno used to hide in the closet when they were negotiating with David Letterman and find out what they said to Letterman, and then he would go back to his agent and tell his agent, "Hey, they're offering Letterman this much. Tell him I'll walk." So
yeah, it's insane to think about, because at that point, then okay, well, ESPN's going to offer this much. That means that we can go get maybe the Big 12 for this, or we can get whatever. Like, you can find different advantages just by sitting in at those meetings. And I've never seen a conference allow that to go on, because in a way it kind of undercuts what the Big Ten can end up eventually making. So if Fox is running the whole show and they're actually sitting in on the meeting, I'm a little confused and concerned, really, for the sport, because really it's just becoming Fox versus ESPN, and I don't think that's good for anybody.
So tell everybody, Gary, what you do. I mentioned Winning Cures Everything, your podcast. I know you just love to cover college football from coast to coast. Your thought? Did you ever want an idea where they can find you?
Go over to winningcureseverything.com. That's the easiest way. It'll take you to the podcast, take you to the YouTube show as well. But I also do the Bet US College Football Show during the season. So myself, Parker Fleming, you guys probably know him. He covered TCU for a while. He's at Stats of War on Twitter. But he and then Kyle Hunter is our handicapper over there. So the Bet US College Football Show is getting back into gear starting up next week. And then people, of course, can find me on Twitter at GaryWCE.
All right, buddy. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate your time. That's Gary Segars again. Winning Cures Everything. I like the name of that site, by the way. And his thoughts that we